Hello again, everyone, and welcome to the Aldersgate Experience, the podcast and video cast of Aldersgate Church in York, Pennsylvania. I'm Pastor Bob Kaler.
And I'm Pastor Jeff Markey.
And producer Randy is behind the desk there running all our audio and video. You notice we're in a new studio, which is really exciting. We've got some stuff we're going to be adding to it.
Yes, we are walking before we run.
We're building the bridge while we walk on it in that sense. And really looking forward to being able to have guests here with us on the podcast.
Absolutely.
We are seeing a growing viewership and listenership to the podcast, so we're glad you've joined us for that. We want to dive today into the Noah story.
Yeah.
And we talked about that on Sunday, but also want to talk a little bit more about sin in general, because it's not a word we use a lot in our culture. You know, we don't use that word too often.
Yeah. We don't. We tried to avoid that topic at all possible, right? Just to not offend anybody. But the Bible makes it very clear what sin is.
Yeah, I've had people in churches say, "You talk about sin an awful lot," and I say, "Well, the Bible does an awful lot because it's a problem.
Big problem.
It is the problem in so many ways." So we want to talk about Noah and the idea that sin becomes so bad by Genesis 6 that God decides to wipe out, to decreate, to open these waters of the heavens above and the waters below, to wipe out all life, but also provides a way out through Noah, saving Noah in the ark and his family to start over again, but still starting again with flawed human beings. So you got some questions you want to throw out as we talk about sin today.
Yeah. So one of the questions is, how does the Bible define sin?
Well, there's a lot of different ranges for how we talk about sin in the Bible. Lawlessness is one of those ways of thinking about it. You know, there's a standard that God set. People don't obey the law. Rebellion is another one, which we see in the garden. We also have this idea of exchanging the worship of God for the worship of his creatures. Paul talks about that in Romans 1. That's how he kind of defines it there. They exchange the truth of God for a lie.
Yeah.
And I read somewhere about, I think it was in Christopher Watkins' book, Biblical Critical Theory. He was talking about what the snake gives Adam and Eve is kind of a noble lie.
Right.
Here, you can be great, but not really. It's really a lie.
Well, and I thought of Matthew 17:17. Jesus said, how long must I be with you, unbelieving and perverse generation? He combined those two words, perverse and unbelieving. So belief and faith would be credited as righteousness, as we see in a lot of the New Testament. Paul writes in Romans 4:5, Galatians 3:6, trusting God, believing God. A lack of faith and doubt, like you said in Genesis 3, did God really say?
Yeah. And those are the kinds of things that kind of kick off the idea of sin, but this idea that we have a boundary that God creates for us and violating that boundary. We had a question on one of our short videos that we posted. So is sin God's fault? Does God get off the hook here? Because humans sin, God has no responsibility in this whatsoever. You brought that question up to me.
Yeah.
So what did you think of when you saw that question?
Yes. The answer is yes.
Yeah.
We have a choice, right?
Yeah, and I think God again creates separating order from chaos, but he has to allow a sense of choice in there.
Yeah.
In order for us to authentically love God, we're not just following the script. Now, again, there are some Christian traditions that would say God is so sovereign that he has predetermined everything, determined that already that Adam and Eve were going to do this because that's the sovereign mind of God. I get that on one level, but on another level, that really does make us kind of cosmic puppets, and it makes God responsible for evil.
Right.
It really turns him into kind of a moral monster in some ways when you spin that out all the way.
Yeah.
Now, there are a lot more subtle arguments around that we can get into, but really, the idea is that humanity unleashes this sin by rebellion against God. It's almost as if God is saying, you had one job,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
one rule
It's true.
to follow.
Just one.
And you didn't do that, so off you go. Now, in the Greek, the word for sin is hamartia, which is a word that comes from archery. It's a word that means to miss the mark,
Right. Wow.
miss the target. So what's the target? Well, it's obedience to God. It's being in that image of God that
Yeah.
we're called to be.
Right.
And that involves true worship. It involves being part of that vocation that God's created us to have. So from a biblical perspective, it's not so much deciding what is good and evil on our own. God has already said that. Here's what good and evil are. We find that by being in relationship with God. But when we take on the autonomy to say, we're going to determine what is good. You go back to Genesis 3. I love that line because it's so descriptive. Eve saw that the fruit was good. She's the first person to say,
Something's good.
something is good other than God.
Yeah.
And other than what God says is good.
Exactly.
And that sets everything down the road. So sin makes us, in this sense, missing the mark, less than human. If we're designed to be humans made in the image of God, we're less than because we've tried to take on the role of God, which we can never be. And so we're less than what God created us to be. Remember that Psalm 8? He created them a little lower than the angels, crowned them with glory and honor. Well, we tarnished that crown,
Yes.
exchanged it to become slaves to sin and our own desires, our own determination of what is good. And I'm quoting Christopher Watkins' book a lot because it's really been a powerful book for me. It's pretty academic, but I really have enjoyed it. Biblical critical theory, which gives the idea that a critical theory is sort of a theory of everything. And so while all these other critical theories are out there, Watkins said, well, the Bible has its own critical theory that we need to pay attention to. And he talks about sin and autonomy, that idea of autonomy being really critical to understanding what sin is about. It's saying, my way.
Yeah.
I did it my way. That's
To quote Sinatra,
that's the idea of
great
sin.
Sinatra.
So when we say we're doing it my way, we're setting aside the wisdom and providence and creative power of God to say, yeah, thanks, but I'm going to do it this way.
Yeah.
And that's when we begin to see things spiral out of control.
Wow. Wow. It's rich.
I like Wesley's definition of sin, John Wesley's definition of sin, which I wrote down again because he really defines it. It's a willful violation of a known law of God, which means we are responsible.
Yeah.
Adam and Eve knew what the rule was. They knew.
Right.
They're responsible. It's not an accident. They're responsible.
Yeah.
We so often will hear people say things like, well, I did this because I'm only human. That's a denigration, I think, of what it really means to be human.
I can understand that. Yeah.
We're made to be in the image of God. We're made to be people who follow this pattern. And so when we say we're only human, we're saying, well, God didn't quite get it right. Sin, I think, makes us less than human. We're mistake prone. Yes, we are, because we're limited in our understanding, in our knowledge. We're limited by our bodies. We're not all knowing. We don't know those things. So yeah, we are prone to mistake. But there's a difference between mistake and willful sin. I remember when Tiger Woods got into trouble with all those women, and I was listening to sports radio, and one of the commentators said, Tiger made some mistakes. And I thought to myself, if I bump into someone's car in a parking lot, that's a mistake.
If he hits the ball in the woods instead of on the green,
yeah. But if I bump into 9 women who aren't my wife, that's something else altogether.
Yeah.
So and that's just one example, where we see sin begin to dehumanize, and it's inherently dehumanizing when we are sinful. Look at what happens with Cain and Abel. Cain says, I'm going to eliminate because I'm going to be superior. I want to be superior. I'm going to eliminate this person. We see this competition, this violence. All those things are about what human sin does to us. It makes us less than human, to the point at which when we see really egregious kinds of horrible things that people do.
On the news every day.
It's animal type behavior.
Yeah.
So we see this sort of dog eat dog kind of thing. It's a devolution of human beings, not saying we're just only human. God created us better than that.
Yeah.
And the question is, how do we get back to being the human beings God created us to be? And we can't do that on our own.
Well, yeah, and I think of I quoted those scriptures before. Romans 4:5, Galatians 3:6, to trust God, to believe God. That only comes from a willingness and a ability to hear what God is saying about it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You have to be open to that and to say, I am not at the center of the universe. It's sort of a Copernican revolution compared to what most of us believe. We're the center of the universe. Everything revolves around us. That's a lot of the way Western culture is structured.
Yeah.
To saying, no, I revolve around something else. My life is tied up in something much bigger than myself. I have a relationship that's beyond. I'm not the center of the universe.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So a lot of sin comes from changing that center of life.
Well,
I remember in Campus Crusade, we had the image of who's on the throne of your life. Is it something? Is it something else that we serve? Because we all have gods. Everybody says, well, I'm an atheist. No, you're really not. You just have a different sort of God. It might be a material God. It might be, your own ego. It might be something along those lines. We all worship something.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the question is, what are we worshiping and how are we ordering our lives around that?
Yeah. I mean, I see it very much in raising my children. When they were very young, 1, 2, 3 years old, it was mine, no.
Evidence of original sin.
Evidence of original sin is right there. And I've got 4 kids. They're all different ages, about 2-3 years apart. And then now I watch them communicate with one another and the way in which they interact. And there's a growth and maturity from that. And it's a beautiful thing. Not everybody gets to see that in their children. And I'm blessed to see that.
And there's growth in that way spiritually.
Yeah.
But it's intentional.
Yeah.
You need spiritual parents.
We work very hard.
You need mentors
Yes.
and people to help shape you in that way, to guide you along the way. No one gets there by themselves. That's the other Western sort of myth that you can be a self-made person, you can make it on your own. And I love Malcolm Gladwell's whole idea. He talks about the fact that, nobody makes it on their own. No matter what endeavor you're doing, we all have people in our lives because we're designed that way.
Yeah, exactly.
And as human beings, sin gets out of control as it spreads through human beings. So does faithfulness.
Yeah.
God enables us to do that because God chooses to work with human agents to make that kind of stuff happen.
Yeah. So why do you think God reacts so strongly to sin?
Well, it seems so harsh. What happens in Genesis 6?
Well, I mean, we didn't live back then. We don't know what it looked like, but it sure paints a grim picture.
It's hard to imagine how bad it gets. The only real parallel, I think, is at the end of the book of Judges.
Yeah.
Where it says everyone did what was right in their own eyes. There was no king in Israel. Everybody did what was right in their own eyes. So you have this corruption that's gotten out of control. But how out of control does it get compared to what we have today?
Which we see the news. I mean, we know what's going on.
What man?
Yeah.
and you're only 6 chapters in.
I know.
And things are going haywire. But I think we ask that question because we react more softly to sin than God does.
I think we're the fish in the fish bowl,
Yeah.
right? Rather than the person feeding the fish.
Yeah,
right.
we don't really think about it in those terms. Oh, certainly it's not that bad or something along those lines. I wrote this down. I said, to put it in computer terms, humans generally see sin as a bug that just needs a system update to fix. That we think that if there's some systemic aspects of sin in society, we can just fix them through better information, better technology.
Humanism, other
and some people suggest even, well, if we just got rid of religion, if we got rid of the idea of sin altogether, then maybe we wouldn't be so uptight about these things. But where does that lead us?
Yeah.
This is the myth of human progress.
Right.
And we've seen a lot of great things in human progress. Somebody asked the other day, because I'm a historian, what era of history would you want to live in the most? And my answer to that is right now.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a big Civil War nerd and other things like that, but I would not want to live that back then.
Right.
When typhoid and cholera and all kinds of things that you can fix with penicillin were. No, we live in a great age.
Yeah.
But at the same time, that technological progress and advancement has not made us better people.
No.
In some ways, we continue to degrade culturally. And so there's this myth of human progress. Things are just going to get better and better until we overcome societal problems. So people put so much faith in things like technology and government, things like that. And we believe that these things are going to solve our problems. But rather than a bug in the system, I think God sees sin as the blue screen of death.
Yeah.
In a Microsoft term, or the spinning rainbow wheel of doom in the Mac system.
Yeah.
It is a system crasher. And sometimes the system is going to have to be rebooted altogether.
Yeah, I had a friend tell me this week, we were just in conversation, I can't remember who it was, but we were just talking about God cares so much. He hates sin so much that he put the one thing that he loved more than anything to death so that he could deal with sin.
Yeah. Yeah. We so want to focus on God's wrath, but notice that every time God gives a warning, I've got to deal with this.
Yeah.
And then who's going to listen? Who's going to listen? You know, I think of Abraham. We're going to get into the Abraham story this coming week. And God looks at Sodom and Gomorrah, for example, and says, I'm going to take them out. You know, I'm going to rain fire on them. And Abraham starts to bargain. What if I find 50 righteous people there? What about 30? What about 20? He gets them down to 10. Well, guess what? There aren't 10.
No.
And so down comes the fire.
Lot and his wife became a pillar of salt.
But the fact that God is negotiating with Abraham around these things, wanting to, and God is restraining until such point at which judgment comes. But the one who judges, as we said, in Jesus Christ, and this is where the New Testament becomes the answer to this.
Right.
The judge is also the one who is the defense attorney.
Yes, that's very true.
Which is a powerful thing to think about. So we're uncomfortable with God's judgment, but it's really the only thing that's going to ultimately set things right. If God is not a righteous judge, then we're doomed.
Yes. Sin has to be dealt with in order for us to see the other side, the new heaven and the new earth. Yeah. Well, talk about relationship, speaking of God's judgment and God's grace.
I think there are two sides of the same coin. I think God's judgment is love. When we discipline our children, we do that out of love. We want them to be whole, to be protected. And I think God's judgment does that for us and universally does that for us, that it's going to set things right. And that's an image of God's grace, because it demonstrates he didn't just set the world spinning and step back and let things run.
Right.
But rather is dealing with it. Now, there are times when we wish he would deal with it more directly and more immediately.
Well, yeah, and his directive towards certain people,
right? Never myself, by the way. Never myself.
Right, exactly.
We love God's judgment on other people, but not on us. So we've got to think about that. But I really think we don't talk enough about God's judgment being part of God's love.
I absolutely love the prayer of confession we pray every week in the traditional service. And it's so poignant and powerful to be able to say, confess that we have sinned against you in thought, word, and deed, by what we have done, by what we have left undone. It's so important that we acknowledge and accept the responsibility of our sin, because if it weren't for, recognizing that, then what was Christ's atonement for? We must accept that. We must understand that we've fallen short ourselves.
It's very important. And it's corrective. It's not a self-flagellation. It's simply saying, Lord, I'm laying this before you because I want to be a different person. I want to be the person you made me to be. It's not just I'm afraid of punishment.
Yeah.
Corrective is always about moving to the next level. What am I learning in my life? How am I growing in faith? And a lot of times when we stumble, God is there to pick us up in that sense.
And oftentimes we generically say, oh, well, everybody sins. Obviously, Paul says it, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. But to be able to acknowledge those personal ones and to be able to recognize those individual sins that we've committed, because those are, when we are able to acknowledge that, it's that's when God's grace is salvific in nature and brings us into that new standing. And it's a part of the sanctification process. It's a part of, becoming more like him.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Oh, that's great. So how does the Noah story move the narrative of Genesis along?
Well, it becomes this beginning of covenant.
Oh, yeah.
Now, some would say that God makes a covenant with Adam in the very beginning. There are several Old Testament scholars that say that, the idea of the tree is a covenant piece. But we see it more overtly, I think, here in the Noah story, where God is making a promise to start again. And he does it out of Noah's faithfulness.
Absolutely.
Not Noah's perfection, as we see, but out of his faithfulness. And we're going to see that pattern then repeat itself right away in Genesis 12 with the Abraham story. This idea of covenant moving forward. Covenant's gonna evolve as the story goes along. But it really begins with Noah, a covenant for the whole creation. God says, I'm not going to destroy this. I'm going to remake it. And I'm going to do that by working with human beings, one man and his family, who are going to become a nation, who then become a worldwide movement.
Right.
A movement of grace and God's renewing power. I was thinking about this the other day. There's so many religions that have ethnic components to them. You'll be ethnically this or ethnically that, and the religion is tied to ethnicity. Christianity is the one religion that isn't.
Yeah.
Because it's designed to be a blessing for the whole creation.
Right.
Through you, God says to Abraham, all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. And that becomes a real sign of hope for the whole creation.
Yeah.
But he's going to do that through the family that's going to become Israel. And that's where we're going to be spending the next several weeks as we get into this. Now, I skipped over the Tower of Babel story. I'm going to be doing a video on that this week, because that's one of those, there are a few times in Genesis where there's this weird story that's just kind of dumped in there. But it looks like it's dumped in there, but it's there for a reason.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the Tower of Babel story is kind of there for a reason. It's sort of the next level where things get bad before we get to Abraham. So we'll talk about that in this week's video.
That's awesome.
Lots more to talk about here with the idea of sin and redemption. And obviously, it's a big topic.
It's huge. I mean, that's the whole narrative that sets the whole thing in motion. Redemption and restoration right there.
And lots of things we can talk about with the Noah story. There's lots of symbolism there, but so many people are so familiar with that story that oftentimes it gets lost in the mix. But I wanted to really approach this week, what's our response? Can we be like Noah and at least say, yeah, I'm gonna do what God says, regardless, even though it's running against the stream, even though it's outside the character of everything else that's going on. I'm gonna do what God calls me to do.
Yeah.
It really just begins there.
Exactly. I was just going to say, for those of you who might be watching and just not sure where to start, Scripture is a great place to start. Just ask for God to speak to you. Sometimes, it's that still small voice that when we're in the midst of the storm that we can start hearing what God says, and then we can obey. As soon as we start that journey, God opens those doors.
Yeah. Well, we want to thank you for joining us on this edition of the Aldersgate Experience. As always, if you have questions or comments, you can send them to us at communications@aldersgateyork.com. We encourage you to leave comments on the videos on our YouTube page. I also encourage you to check out my Substack page, bobkaler.substack.com, where we post the midweek videos, and those are also on our YouTube page. Generating lots of content for this series because, again, Genesis is really a foundational book. It's the origins for so much of what we look at in the Bible and so much of what we deal with in life. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you back here next week on the Aldersgate Experience.
Take care.